My family said my struggles were karma for not being a people pleaser. Now I own the business they all work for, and they still don't know it. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and for most of my life, my family made me feel like I was the problem. I grew up in a house where silence was called respect, and obedience was mistaken for love. My parents cared more about how things looked to neighbors than how things actually felt behind closed doors. We were the perfect family on the outside. Sunday church, polite smiles, and matching outfits at every family photo. But inside, I was the one who constantly got blamed when the mask cracked. My sister, Melissa, could do no wrong. She was the golden child, pretty, polite, the type who'd pretend to care while making sure everyone knew she was better. My brother, Adam, was the easy one, the peacemaker. Meanwhile, I was the kid who asked why. Why does Melissa get to go out when I can't? Why do you yell at me but not Adam? Simple questions that made my parents' faces twist with anger. My father's words still echo, because you don't know your place. Dinner time always felt like a silent war. I'd sit there pushing food around my plate while Mom bragged about Melissa's grades and Adam's charm. The moment I tried to speak about my own small achievements, like fixing a neighbor's computer or winning a small school contest, she'd roll her eyes and say, "Not everything has to be about you." The worst part? Everyone laughed. It became a family joke that I was too sensitive or always the victim. I remember once, after a particularly cruel argument, my father looked at me and said, "You'll never succeed with that attitude, son. The world doesn't care about your feelings." That line buried itself deep in me. I didn't realize it then, but that sentence would define how I fought. Not to prove him wrong, but to finally prove to myself that I wasn't broken. Still, every time I tried to pull away, they reminded me that I was lucky to have them. And maybe, for a long time, I believed that lie, until the day I realized being part of their world meant losing myself completely. Growing up, it became painfully clear that my role in the family wasn't to be loved, it was to make everyone else look better by comparison. Melissa became the pride of my parents' dinner conversations. "She's working with a law firm now," my mom would boast to guests, smiling like she personally built her. Adam joined the family business right after college, instantly labeled responsible and the future of the company. And me? I was the cautionary tale. The "don't end up like him" example whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. I tried to make peace with it at first. I told myself not every family shows affection the same way, but their words started eating into my self-worth. When I landed a decent job after college, my mom's first reaction wasn't pride. It was disbelief. "You, in an office? Let's hope it lasts longer than your last one." She laughed, but it wasn't funny. My father joined in, clapping me on the back a little too hard, saying, "Maybe you're finally learning some discipline." Every accomplishment was downgraded into luck or temporary success. Family gatherings were the worst. Melissa would talk about her new car, Adam about his promotions, and I'd sit quietly, pretending to check my phone just to survive the humiliation. Once, I mentioned I was saving up to start my own small business. My sister chuckled. "That's cute. You should probably stick to something stable, though. You're not really the entrepreneur type." My dad nodded in agreement. "Yeah, son, you don't have the patience for real responsibility." It wasn't the words that broke me. It was how casually they said them. Like I was a joke they'd told so many times they forgot it still hurt. When I finally said, "I'm trying my best," my mom looked me dead in the eye and said, "Maybe this is just karma for the way you talk back." That sentence burned more than I cared to admit, because for the first time, I realized something dark. In my family's story, I wasn't just the disappointment. I was the punishment they thought I deserved. The night after that dinner, I sat in my car outside their house for almost an hour, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was done. Done trying to earn love that was never going to come. Done shrinking myself just to fit into their version of acceptable. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would build something that had nothing to do with them. Something that proved I wasn't the screw-up they wanted me to be. I packed up what little I had, a few clothes, an old laptop, and the stubborn belief that I could figure life out on my own. I moved into a cheap one-bedroom apartment in a rough part of town. The walls were thin, the heater barely worked, and some nights I'd fall asleep listening to my neighbors argue through the drywall. But, for the first time, it was quiet. Not the kind of silence that punished, but the kind that let me breathe. I took whatever jobs I could find. During the day, I stocked shelves at a hardware store. At night, I taught myself coding and basic e-commerce, watching YouTube tutorials until my eyes blurred. I remember the smell of burnt coffee and instant noodles filling the room as I worked on a second-hand laptop that wheezed every time I opened more than 3 tabs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every small success, fixing a bug, landing a freelance client, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Of course, my family saw it differently. My mom would call occasionally, her voice dripping with polite pity. "You really should come back, honey. Working like that isn't a life." My dad once texted, "You can always join the family business. There's no shame in admitting defeat." I never replied, because deep down, I knew going back meant surrendering the only thing I'd ever fought for, my freedom. And as I watched the city lights flicker through my cracked window that night, I realized something powerful. Even if I failed, I'd rather fail on my own terms than live the rest of my life under theirs. 2 years later, that tiny apartment looked completely different. The walls were still cracked, the furniture still cheap, but the air felt lighter, alive. My small freelance gigs had turned into a real business. I started offering web design and digital marketing to local stores, and word spread faster than I expected. I'll never forget the first time a client handed me a check that covered an entire month's rent. I just sat there, staring at it, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Pride that wasn't tainted by someone else's approval. When I finally visited home that Christmas, I thought maybe things would be different. I wanted to share my progress, to tell them that I was finally doing something right. But the second I stepped through the door, I felt the same old weight settle on my shoulders. My mother smiled too widely, like she was forcing it. "Well, look who decided to visit," she said, handing me a half-warm plate of food. Melissa was already on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Still doing that computer thing?" she asked without looking up. "Must be nice to play around online all day." My father didn't even ask about my work. He just launched into how Adam had secured a big contract for the family business. "Now that's how you build something real," he said, glancing at me. The message was clear. No matter what I did, it would never measure up. Later that night, I overheard Melissa talking to a cousin in the kitchen. Her voice was low but sharp. "He gets one lucky break and suddenly thinks he's successful. Give it a year. He'll burn out like he always does." I stood there in the hallway, heart pounding, realizing that even my success threatened them. It wasn't pride that kept them distant. It was envy disguised as concern. As I drove back home through the empty streets, I couldn't stop hearing her words replay in my head. I had finally built something of my own, yet somehow they found a way to make it feel small. But I didn't know then. That bitterness I felt that night would soon become my greatest fuel. By the time my business began gaining traction, I'd started landing corporate clients. Small at first, but steady. One of those companies, a mid-sized manufacturing firm, happened to source materials from my family's business. It felt ironic, like fate was giving me a chance to bridge that broken connection. Against my better judgment, I called my father. "Dad, I think there's an opportunity here," I said, pacing my apartment. "The company I'm working with could partner with you on supply deals. It might help both sides." There was silence on the other end before he finally said, "You? You're working with them?" His tone wasn't surprise, it was disbelief. "Son, this isn't a game. Leave the business stuff to people who know what they're doing." "I'm serious, Dad. I can set up a meeting." He sighed, the kind of sigh that always made me feel 10 years old again. "Fine, but don't embarrass me." I showed up to that meeting wearing my best suit, documents prepared, strategy ready. The executives respected my ideas. They even said my proposal could help streamline logistics. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe my family would finally see I was worth something. But 2 days later, the company called to cancel. No explanation, no apology. Confused, I reached out to one of the managers I'd befriended. He hesitated before telling me the truth. "Someone from your family business called. Said you were unreliable, that you tend to overpromise and create chaos. They didn't want to risk it." I remember sitting in my car afterward, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My brother's voice echoed in my mind. Calm, smug, predictable. "It's nothing personal, man. You know how Dad gets when you try to mix family and work." But it was personal. My own blood had sabotaged me, and for what? To keep me in my place. To make sure I never rose above the label they gave me. That was the day something inside me broke. Not in weakness, but in clarity. If family could betray me this easily, I had no reason left to protect them. And as I drove away from that shattered opportunity, a quiet thought took root. One day, I'd build something so powerful they couldn't touch it, even if they tried. The fallout from that betrayal hit harder than I expected. The canceled deal rippled through my client base like a curse. Suddenly, people stopped replying to my emails. Projects that were confirmed went silent overnight. It didn't take long before rent notices started piling up on my kitchen counter, bright red reminders of how quickly stability could vanish. My savings were gone within months. I started skipping meals to keep the lights on, rationing instant noodles like they were luxury dinners. Nights were the worst. I'd sit at my small desk, the glow of my laptop flickering as I refreshed my inbox. Nothing. The same silence that once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. One evening, I stared at my reflection in the black screen and whispered, "Maybe they were right." I hated myself for even thinking it, but the doubt was louder than my determination. Out of desperation, I texted my mother. I typed, "I just need a small loan to cover rent. I'll pay you back, I promise." Her reply came 20 minutes later. "Maybe this is the universe teaching you humility. You can't always do things your way." That was it. No empathy, no concern. Just a lesson wrapped in cruelty. I laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was the kind of laugh that hurts your chest because you know crying won't change anything. I thought about calling my brother, but I already knew how that would go. He'd probably say something like, "You made your bed, bro. Time to lie in it." The irony was sharp. My family, who claimed to value unity, had no problem watching me drown. The people who called me selfish were the same ones who'd let me starve just to prove they were right. One night, I came home to find an eviction notice taped to my door. I sank to the floor, cold concrete pressing against my palms, the sound of distant traffic humming through the walls. That was my rock bottom. No money, no family, no direction. Just me. The silence and the realization that if I wanted to survive, I'd have to rebuild from ashes they left behind, and that's exactly what I planned to do. Even if it meant becoming someone they wouldn't recognize anymore. I was down to my last $100 when I met Harold. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, the kind of person who carried quiet authority. Not the loud, performative kind my father used to fake. We'd met months earlier when I'd done a small freelance job for his logistics company. Out of nowhere, he called me one morning. "You disappeared on me, kid." "What happened?" I hesitated before telling him everything. The canceled contracts, the family sabotage, the eviction notice still taped to my door. I expected him to hang up or offer pity. Instead, he said something that made me sit up straight. "Good. You've hit bottom. That's when real builders are born. You still want to build something?" Within days, he invited me to his office, a modest space that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He offered to mentor me, to invest in whatever idea I still believed in. "But on one condition," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You don't tell anyone who you're working with. Let them underestimate you. It's your best weapon." Together, we started a small holding company. He taught me how to structure silent partnerships, how to hide ownership through layered subsidiaries, how to let your enemies dig their own graves while you hold the deed to the land they're standing on. When he asked what industry I wanted to start with, I didn't hesitate. "Suppliers," I said. "The ones who feed local manufacturing chains." It was poetic justice, the same chain my family relied on. Within 6 months, we acquired our first struggling supplier. Within a year, 3 more. None of them had any idea that the quiet investor behind the deals was the same failure my family laughed at. Every late-night strategy session, every signed contract, every dollar reinvested felt like revenge wrapped in discipline. I didn't just want success anymore, I wanted silence, the kind that comes when power shifts without anyone realizing it. And as Harold said when we closed our 5th acquisition, smiling like he already knew how this story would end, "Let them keep talking, kid. You'll own their words before they know it." Over the next 3 years, everything changed. Not overnight, but piece by piece in the quietest way possible. Harold and I built our empire in the shadows. He handled negotiations and I handled the operations, the numbers, systems, digital presence, all under layers of company names no one could trace back to me. Every acquisition fed into the next, each success funding a larger move. It was like playing chess with the people who once mocked me, except they didn't even realize I was on the board. By the 2nd year, our small holding company controlled logistics routes, packaging suppliers, and digital services used by half the regional manufacturing market, including my family's business. I'd see their company's name pop up on invoices and couldn't help but smirk. They were now buying from me without knowing it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The failure was now signing their paychecks. Harold used to say, "Never announce power, let them feel it." And that became my motto. I stayed off social media, turned down interviews, and operated strictly under aliases. My life was simple. 1-bedroom apartment upgraded to a quiet townhouse, long nights filled with spreadsheets and late calls, and mornings that started with the soft sound of coffee machines instead of arguments. The silence that once suffocated me now fueled me. Occasionally, I'd get calls from home, my mom asking when I'd finally get serious about my career, Melissa bragging about her latest vacation, Adam complaining about supply delays. I'd bite my tongue, pretending to be just another distant relative catching up. "Yeah, tough times all around," I'd say, suppressing a grin, knowing I was the one tightening their margins. But beneath the satisfaction was something else, a quiet ache. Part of me still wanted them to see me, to say, "We were wrong," but I knew that would never come. They didn't want truth. They wanted hierarchy. So instead of chasing validation, I focused on something bigger, ownership. And as our empire grew stronger, I realized something almost poetic. They had spent years trying to make me feel small. Now they were working inside the walls I built, and they still didn't have a clue. It started as a whisper in the industry. My family's company was struggling. Orders were delayed, suppliers were pulling back, and the once glossy reputation of Miller & Sons Manufacturing was fading fast. I didn't pay much attention at first. Part of me assumed they'd find a way to spin it like they always did. But when I saw their name on a list of companies seeking emergency financing, something in me paused. I hadn't caused their downfall directly, but I knew the competition tightening around them, the one I'd helped create, was squeezing them hard. A few weeks later, I got a call from Adam. I hadn't heard his voice in over a year. "Hey man," he said casually, like nothing had ever happened. "We've been having some hiccups at work. Dad was wondering if you could give us a little insight on digital restructuring. You know, since that's your thing now." I almost laughed. After years of being mocked, suddenly my expertise mattered. "You sure you want my help?" I asked. "Last I heard, I wasn't responsible enough for real business." He chuckled awkwardly. "Yeah, well, things change." I could hear my father's voice faintly in the background asking, "Did he say yes?" The irony was delicious. I wanted to say no, to hang up and let them drown in their arrogance. But instead I kept my tone calm. "Send me your reports," I said. "I'll take a look." When the files arrived, I realized just how bad it was. Mismanaged budgets, overpriced materials, internal conflicts. They were bleeding money through inefficiency, and the funniest part? Half their expenses went to suppliers I secretly owned. Every invoice they paid was feeding the very machine that was pushing them under. The next week, my mother called. Her voice was soft, rehearsed. "Sweetheart, maybe you could talk to your father directly. He's been stressed." I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "Maybe this is karma," I said quietly, echoing her own words back to her. for the way you treated people who only wanted to help." The silence on the other end told me she understood exactly what I meant. But this time, I didn't feel it. I let the weight of it hang there, like a ghost of all the years they made me feel small. Because now, for the first time, I wasn't the problem. I was the consequence. Watching my family's company unravel from a distance was strangely peaceful. There was no satisfaction in their pain, only a cold sense of inevitability. Every arrogant decision they'd made, every cruel word they'd spoken, it all came full circle. Harold noticed my detachment one day and said, "You don't need revenge, kid. Just balance." But I wasn't sure anymore if I could separate the two. When their financial collapse hit the news, Harold came into my office holding a folder. "You ready to close the circle?" Inside were acquisition papers for a silent buyout. One of our subsidiaries would absorb Miller & Sons Manufacturing under the guise of a rescue merger. On paper, it looked like a lifeline. In reality, it was a surrender. We drafted the offer carefully. The deal came from a foreign investor group, complete with forged layers of ownership and fake executive names. The terms were generous enough to make it look like salvation. A full bailout, guaranteed jobs, and a promise to restore family legacy. They didn't even hesitate. Within a week, my brother called, his voice dripping with false confidence. "We've got a buyer," he said. "Finally, someone who sees our value." "Really?" I asked, forcing a neutral tone. "That's great news. What's the deal like?" "Confidential," he replied smugly. "But it's big. Dad's already celebrating. You should come over." I thanked him and hung up before my laugh could slip through. That night, Harold poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across the table. "To ghosts," he said, "because that's what they'll be after this." As I signed the final authorization, I felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not even triumph. Just quiet release. The same people who once told me I'd never succeed without them had, unknowingly, sold me everything they'd built. They threw a family dinner that weekend to celebrate the deal of a lifetime. I wasn't invited, of course, but if I had been, I think I'd have raised a glass and said the one thing they never wanted to hear. "You work for me now." And the best part? They wouldn't even know it. Not yet. For months after the acquisition, I stayed completely silent. The company, my company now, underwent a slow transformation. Systems were overhauled, old inefficiencies eliminated, and for the first time in years, employees were actually being treated with respect. The whispers began almost immediately. The new ownership is strict but fair. There's a new culture, cleaner, smarter. No one knew where the directives came from, only that the results were undeniable. I received progress reports weekly under my alias: revenue up, waste down, employee satisfaction rising. Ironically, the company was thriving more than it ever had, because it was finally free of their control. But even as everything improved, my family's confusion deepened. Melissa called one night. "Something's weird," she said. "The new management barely talks to Dad. They've stopped taking his input." I smiled, sipping my coffee in silence. "Maybe they just know what they're doing," I said. A few weeks later, I received an invitation. Annual stakeholder meeting. Miller & Sons Manufacturing. My name, well, my alias's name, was on the ownership roll. I decided it was time. When I walked into the conference room, the air shifted. My father sat at the head of the table, gray creeping through his hair, frustration etched across his face. My siblings whispered to each other, confused by my presence. "What are you doing here?" Adam asked. I set a file on the table and met their eyes. "I'm here because I own this company." The room went still. My father laughed, but it broke halfway through. "That's not possible. You're lying." I slid the paperwork across the table. Proof of every silent acquisition, every signed agreement. Melissa's hand covered her mouth. Adam's face drained of color. My father looked at the pages like they were knives. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You remember when you told me I'd never succeed without you?" I said softly. "Turns out I succeeded because of you. Every cruel word was fuel. Every dismissal built this. No one spoke. The same silence that once shamed me now protected me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the problem. I felt like the storm they never saw coming. And as I walked out of that room, their stunned faces burned into my memory, I realized. This was the closure I'd been chasing my whole life. But it wasn't revenge I felt. It was freedom. After that day, I never went back to the office again. I didn't need to. My presence had already rewritten everything. Within weeks, the company transitioned fully under my direction. The family name stayed for branding. Public familiarity had its perks, but the people behind it were quietly replaced piece by piece. My father retired under pressure. My brother was reassigned to a meaningless advisory role, and Melissa stopped showing up altogether once she realized no one listened to her anymore. The dynasty they'd used to shame me had become a ghost of itself, profitable, polished, and perfectly distant. But I wasn't cruel. I didn't fire them. I didn't humiliate them publicly. That would have made me just like them. Instead, I let silence do the work. Silence in meetings they weren't invited to. Silence in pay slips that no longer carried their signatures. Silence when they called me pretending to check in. My revenge wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind that reshapes everything while no one's looking. One afternoon, I visited the office unannounced. The building looked brighter, cleaner, alive again. Employees smiled when they saw me, though few knew who I really was. As I walked past the executive hallway, I heard my father's voice through a cracked door, low and bitter. "I don't even know who owns this place anymore," he muttered. I stopped for a moment, listening to the same man who once said I'd never succeed without him. Now lost inside something he no longer controlled. I could have stepped in. I could have told him. But instead I whispered under my breath, "You do, Dad. You just don't recognize him." And then I walked away. Now, years later, I live quietly, far from the noise of family expectations or their hollow apologies. Harold retired peacefully, proud of what we built. The company continues to thrive under my leadership, though my name remains hidden in the paperwork. I don't need credit. I don't need validation. Because in the end, success wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was never broken. That the kid they called a disappointment grew into the man who owned every piece of their legacy and walked away with his peace intact. And that's the real power they never understood. Silence speaks loudest when it no longer needs to explain itself.